Investigators in New Mexico have revealed their initial findings into a deadly movie set shooting that involved actor Alec Baldwin. Baldwin fired a prop gun during rehearsal for the movie Rust last week, killing cinematographer Helena Hutchins. The director was also hurt in the shooting. The sheriff's department said during a press conference today 2 people handled the gun before it was given to Baldwin. The sheriff also said there were 3 guns in the vicinity of where the shooting happened. All of them are being tested by the FBI. Witnesses say the weapon fired as Baldwin was practicing drawing the gun from a holster. During today's press conference, the sheriff spoke about the use of real weapons on set.
I think the industry has had a record recently of being safe. I think there was some complacency on this set, and I think there are some safety issues that need to be addressed by the industry and possibly by the state of New Mexico, but I'll leave that up to the industry and the state to determine what those need to be.
The shooting is prompting calls to better regulate firearms on sets. Others are pushing to replace them altogether with computer-generated imagery. To talk more about this, I'd like to bring in CBS News security and law enforcement analyst James Gagliano. James, welcome. Great to see you. So the DA and sheriff's office didn't really reveal all that much today. We are a week into this investigation. Would you expect things in the case to be further along at this point?
No, Tanya. Actually, I think that the pace of an investigation is what the pace is, and that's not a cop-out. What I'm saying is, or what I'm suggesting, is that there are a lot of forensic pieces to this. There's going to be a lot of witness interviews, and then there's going to be a lot of interviews of people that might have been involved with this production company before or on similar sets. There's a lot of work to be done here. I don't think it should be rushed. I do feel like the key piece of evidence here is going to be proving chain of custody. We all know now, after listening to CBS and hearing the news reports, that every movie set that uses firearms has an armorer. This armorer is typically a former law enforcement officer. I've got a lot of my colleagues, former FBI firearms instructors like myself, who've worked on these type of sets. Determining who handed the gun to whom and who checked it to make sure that there were no live rounds in it. The number one rule, the number one cardinal sin is that there should never be a live round on a movie set. And unfortunately, Tanya, that's what it appears to be at this juncture, a mistake of a live round placed inside a weapon that was going to be used as a movie prop.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question to you. I mean, incredible that there was a live round in a prop gun at all, but incredible that there were any live rounds on the set at all, correct? I mean, who would have brought live rounds to the set? Is there any reason for that?
There are none. And sometimes you'll have on-set security. That's a different piece as far as being part of the cast and the crew. There shouldn't. So there are 3 types of actual, what we think of as bullets that you could use on a movie set. There's a live round, which should never be there. That's something that has powder inside of a casing, and it usually has a lead bullet or a projectile at the end that's going to go out and harm somebody. Number 2 would be what we call a blank, which means it's got powder in it, it makes the noise, it gives the flash, but there's no projectile in it. And number 3 is a dummy round, and a dummy round is simply mocked up or designed to look like an actual bullet. In this instance, and I know that the sheriff at the press conference had said that there were some 500+ rounds that they're examining that were on the set itself, and there was a mixture of those 3 type of rounds. And again, I'm always careful not to Monday morning quarterback things, but this just seems like an unconscionable and preventable mistake, Tanya.
Right. And of course, you say that there should never be live rounds, on a movie set. The Wall Street Journal and LA Times are reporting that there was another accidental shooting on the set in the days before the deadly incident. Now, that wasn't discussed during today's press briefing. But do we know if that is being looked into and whether it would have bearing on this case? Because as you say, there should never be live rounds on the set, but are there actual laws around that? I mean, would someone have been breaking a law if they brought live rounds on the set?
I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, this is out in the Southwest in New Mexico. Gun laws are different in every state. There's no all-encompassing gun law. So whatever New Mexico state laws in regards to that, I think you can own a handgun out there. I'm fairly certain that the person that would have been the armorer in charge of the weapons would have had a pistol permit. It is unconscionable that you would have had mixed in actual live rounds. I mean, look, this is a situation where, do I believe that Alec Baldwin or do I believe that somebody's going to get charged with manslaughter or criminally negligent homicide here? I don't, but the argument can be made that recklessness, inattentiveness, and carelessness, and those are the three pieces of criminally negligent homicide, they could be argued here. And so, yes, that is something investigators are going to be looking into. Did the production team, did the crew, did the people in charge of making this movie and other movies, did they have a lackadaisical case history, a complacency issue, as the sheriff pointed out in New Mexico? And was there a pattern here? Can we prove that there was a dangerous pattern of inattention to detail when it came to firearms?
Right, and that's where that other shooting might come into play, correct? Because you can't say, well, nobody knew there were there was any live ammunition on the set. If there had been another shooting, at least some people knew that there was live ammunition on the set. So I guess that's something investigators will be looking into. So producers for the movie say they've hired a law firm to investigate the shooting. Is that normal in this kind of case?
Well, I mean, look, do concurrent investigations sometimes go on? Absolutely. Let's say that somebody is working for the defense and they want to conduct a separate investigation. That's all well and good. That's not the investigation that matters in a court of law when it comes to prosecution. It could matter for the defense. So, yes, there can be concurrent investigations. They may want to see the evidence that involves the firearm itself, the rounds itself, because I know they recovered the rounds from, obviously, the cinematographer who was tragically killed and the assistant director who was wounded by a piece of shrapnel. They're going to want to examine those things. But first and foremost, New Mexico is going to conduct their own investigation here and determine whether or not anybody is going to be criminally culpable here. That's going to be the big question: is will there be guilt, or was this just a tragic accident and those things happen?
Right. All right. Well, James Gagliano, thank you so much. We appreciate your insight.
Thanks, Tanya.